afternoon again. This is my favorite week of the year. This is the week that allows me to get through Indiana snow and ice and gloomy gray skies day after day after day. So, however it goes over, I'm having a good time. The topic I chose for this year, by the way, this is the 11th year we've been doing this. I didn't think it was a good idea when it started, so you can see how right I am. I picked the title, The Death of Jesus. What happened and what does it mean? And then I added a little phrase, tragedy versus exaltation. What I really am going to be talking about will be the Passion narrative. And specifically, the Passion narrative of St. Mark. Over the course of 11 years, we touched on that. Matter of fact, the very first time we met here, the topic was sort of generically the Passion narrative of Mark, and we did some general things on that. I don't know about you, but I don't remember much of what I said 11 years ago. I suspect it's the same with you. Another important thing to keep in mind is that this year we are in Cycle B of Gospel readings, which means that next Sunday, Palm Sunday, which is the first time in Holy Week that we will proclaim the entire Passion narrative of a Gospel. And the Gospel we will be proclaiming will be St. Mark. Now, when we do that in church, it's a little difficult to stay focused and pay attention exactly to what's going on. We're trying to figure out how to keep standing for that long a period. And we split up the Passion, and we want to make sure we get in our part, which is usually crucify him. We don't want to miss that. But we don't have a lot of time at that point to think carefully of what we're saying. So it might be helpful if we spend a little time looking at some of the details. Remember why this is important, this Passion narrative of Mark. And of all of the Passion narratives, and each Gospel has one, Mark is the most important. And the reason is Mark is the oldest. The very first attempt at putting together this narrative of the death of Jesus was done by this person we call St. Mark. It probably circulated by word of mouth first, and then eventually it got put into writing, but it still circulated separately from anything else. It was probably one of the very first kinds of proclamation of the gospel that the church actually did. In fact, the rest of the gospel material, we can say, was built around the Passion narrative. So even though it comes at the end of the story, it really is the center of the story. When Matthew decides to put his gospel together, and that was somewhat maybe 10 or 12 years after Mark. Remember, Mark wrote his gospel in the year 70. A few years later, Matthew wrote his, but he borrowed most of it from Mark, including the Passion narrative. He makes a few little changes, but by and large, why invent the wheel? If Mark's is good, I'll just use that. Luke does the same thing. However, when you get to John, John doesn't. John has his own perspective. It says a lot of the same things, but it says those things in a different way. We'll look before the end of the week a little bit at John. But for the most part, we want to focus on this very important, ancient tradition of the Passion narrative of Mark. It really begins in chapter 14 of Mark, so if you want to read it sometime yourself, you can read chapters 14, 15, and 16. But there's more to it simply than that. Let's look for a moment at what the community that Mark wrote this for, what was it thinking? What was going on? Let's try to pretend, although it will be hard to do. Let's just say this is the group, us, right here. We are the early followers of Jesus. Some of us might even have been among those first people called, but if not, other people have told us about Jesus, and we have found it convincing. Here's what we have found convincing. We have come to believe that Jesus of Nazareth is, in fact, the long-awaited Messiah. The Messiah that we have at least thought and believed was predicted in many of those Old Testament prophets. Maybe even in the book of Deuteronomy, where we are told a prophet like Moses will come, and so forth. We have come to believe that this Jesus, the one who just came from down the road there at Nazareth, everybody knew, he is the Messiah. Now, while we believe that, and remember, most of us all would be Jews. We would not think that this separates us, that we're no longer Jews. We're certainly Jews. And remember, lots of people could be Jews in different ways. You had Pharisees, they were Jews. You had Sadducees, who didn't agree with Pharisees, but they were Jews. You had Essenes, who were kind of strange folks. You know, they hung out there on the northwest corner of the Dead Sea, waiting for the coming of the Lord and preparing by prayer and ritual. They did not like the Jerusalem temple. They thought it was all corrupt, but still they were considered Jews. We even had some terrorists, the Zealots, who had given up on the political system, and they thought the best way to get things done is just kill your opponent. And so that was their goal. All of those were considered Jews. And so nobody would say our idea would alienate us from Judaism, namely that Jesus is the Messiah. And as long as we stayed on that plane, we were okay. We were able to participate in the synagogue. You remember why that was important? By being Jews of the synagogue, the Roman Empire gave us certain exemptions that we wanted. We wouldn't have to serve in the military. That was good. Certain taxes we wouldn't have to pay. That was even better. And we would not have to participate in civil religion, that religion that we had to gather together periodically and throw incense to Caesar and sing songs about Caesar being God and all of that. Most everybody who did that didn't believe it anyway, but you know, you had to do it if you were going to be a good citizen. Well, those of us in the synagogue didn't have to do that. So that was really good. But then we pushed the thing further. We not only said, you know, we believe Jesus is the Messiah, the one promised through our basic Jewish scriptures. We also believe that he was the Son of God. Well, that got some eyebrows raising, especially within some of the segments of Judaism, like the Pharisees. We would be confronted with that belief. They would say, how can you believe that? And how can you believe that and be a good Jew? Because remember, we, good Jews, We believe in monotheism. Fancy word to say we believe there is only one God. And we believe that that is dictated to us by the first commandment. And to be a Jew, we have agreed whatever else we will do, we will abide by that very sacred first commandment. There is only one God, and you shall have no other gods before the one God. No statues, no anything. Now, you all are saying that this Jesus of Nazareth is not only the Messiah, but you are saying he is the Son of God. That means you believe he is divine. And if you believe he is divine, then you believe he is God. And if you believe he is God, then you believe in two gods. Yahweh, the God of our fathers, and Jesus, your Son of God. And you can't do that. Well, at least you can't do that and be a good Jew. Well, that caused a lot of tension with us. Because then they told us, and if you're not willing to give up that belief of Jesus being the Son of God, you're going to get expelled from the synagogue. Now that's pretty serious. Remember what we would lose. We'd lose everything. Our status, our exemptions, our way of life. We would just plummet. Nobody wants to be expelled from the synagogue. So no doubt we got together and we asked, what are we going to do? We've got our belief system. We believe Jesus is the Messiah, but that's no problem. Nobody cares about that. What are we going to do about this belief we have come to hold that says Jesus is the Son of God? No doubt our discussions were heated. But in the end, contrary to what the other Jews thought, in the end we said we're staying with our belief. It's our belief, and we are going to hold on to it no matter what. Well, the no matter what ended up being a lot. Ultimately, not right at the time of Mark, but a little bit later, certainly by the time of John's Gospel, those of us who maintained Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God, we had been kicked out of the synagogue. If you want to read what that might have seemed like, or what our response would have been, look in the Gospel of Matthew sometime, chapter 23. There you will get a portrait of Jesus going at the Pharisees with tooth and nail. It's about as violent as you'll ever find. And you wonder, is that what he really did? Well, many would say that probably is Matthew putting some of that vitriolic language in the mouth of Jesus, because the Jews had kicked us out of the synagogue, and Matthew is outraged. John 9 will give you a version of the same thing, where the parents, remember, of the man born blind, they come and they question the parents about this man, what they know and what they don't know. And we are told there that the parents didn't want to say much because they were afraid of being expelled from the synagogue. So that was bad. And we ended up having to endure a good bit of suffering. So our belief that Jesus is the Messiah and he is the Son of God has cost us something. We've had to pay a price. And that price is we lost our status. And that price has been that now we get persecuted from two areas. One from the synagogue itself, and the other from the Roman government, because somehow they think we're about to take over the government. They think that's what we mean when we proclaim Jesus to be a king in the kingdom of God. I don't know where they got all that, but that's what they think. And so they're very, very paranoid about us. So that's the setting that we're in before this passion narrative came to be written. In a way, the passion narrative is a response to all that. But it's a response to some other things, too. And here are some of those other things. How are we going to convince other people that Jesus is the Messiah? Now, you might say, well, what's difficult about that? Well, here are a few things. Not every Jew expected the Messiah. There were many Jews who thought that was a belief that did not seem to be attractive, that we were not expecting some outside person to intervene, that wasn't just what we believed in. So we didn't pay any attention to that. Okay, there's that group. There's another group that says, well, Messiah, we're not sure what that would even mean. And then we would say, well, look at the Scriptures. What do you find there? And then they would tell us, well, okay, here's what we found there, and here's what we think a Messiah would have and be. First of all, a Messiah would have to be anonymous. That's what those Scriptures say. You don't know where the Messiah comes from. He's like, remember in Genesis, that King Melchizedek? No mother, no father. He just all of a sudden out of the blue pops up there. Then disappears. Doesn't have a big role to play, but you kind of wonder about him. Well, that's the way the Messiah was supposed to be, anonymous. What's wrong with that? Well, you're saying Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah? Yep, that's what we're saying. Are you familiar that he lived right down the street here? We know his parents. We know his siblings. We know him. He doesn't have an anonymous bone in his body. And you're going to say he is the Messiah? The one who is supposed to be anonymous? That doesn't work. That doesn't make any sense at all. You better go back and rethink that. The Messiah, so they would tell us also, the word itself means anointed. Hebrew word is Mashiach. When it gets translated into Greek, the Greek word will be Christos. Whenever you would hear that word, Messiah, anointed one, you would think of two things. One, dead people, because we always anointed our dead people. And royalty. We think of royalty. Kingdom. The king. Who was the greatest king we ever had? Well, everybody knows that. David, of course. David was the Messiah, the anointed one, proclaimed to be the greatest king we ever had. When we say we believe in the coming of a Messiah, what we are really saying is we believe there will be a successor to King David. Because his monarchy died out, and we think it's going to come back. And as a matter of fact, we believe Jesus is that person who is going to come and fulfill the role of King David. And what was King David famous for? He was most famous because he was a warrior. He was a soldier. He was the one responsible for making Israel the greatest nation in the world, both in terms of population and territory. He was the one who led all those battles against the Philistines. He was the one who very cleverly, remember, found this little city, a town that nobody cared about. It was an old Canaanite town with the name Jerusalem. And he bought it, kind of. He really just went and took it. But nonetheless, he got it. And then he went and found the Ark of the Covenant. Now remember, the Ark of the Covenant was supposed to be that box on wheels that the Israelites took with them everywhere, especially in war. Inside the box was supposed to be the 2 slabs of the 10 Commandments, symbolizing, of course, the presence of God. Somehow they had lost that. Now don't ask me, how could you lose the Ark of the Covenant? Because I don't know. But they started to ask around, well, where did that thing go? Where is that? Well, last I knew, the Philistines had it. So they found out the Philistines did indeed have it. One of those battles, they somehow captured the Ark of the Covenant. But they didn't need it, didn't want it, didn't do them any good, because every time they touched it, they died. So it was a mute thing for them. So David went up, and there was some negotiation and a lot of war. He recaptured the Ark of the Covenant. He brought it down to Jerusalem, that city he had just gotten. Enshrined the Ark of the Covenant in the city, and overnight he united the kingdom. A brilliant political and religious move. But David is always remembered by us as a great warrior. So you're going to tell me that Jesus of Nazareth is the successor to King David. That Jesus of Nazareth is the anointed one. That Jesus of Nazareth is the one who's going to continue on the dynasty of King David. If he is going to do that in any way, shape, or form, he has to be a warrior. He has to be a soldier. He has to be a military person, because that was preeminently what David was. No one can be the successor of King David unless he is a very powerful soldier, warrior. Well, you can tell there are lots of problems with that. We believe Jesus is the Messiah, the anointed one, but he didn't do anything that would even remotely link him up with being a soldier. He wasn't at all interested in or showed any signs of wanting to be a warrior. He didn't organize any kind of military groups. You never find him getting in border skirmishes. Closest thing he comes to violence is when he drives a couple money changers out of the temple and dumps over a few things. Pretty harmless. Nobody got hurt. Just caused a mess. That was all. But you wouldn't call that an act of King David. You know, if King David were going to do that, there'd be a whole bunch of people laying there dead. It showed him. So you want this Jesus of Nazareth to be your Messiah. And he has no military experience whatsoever. Yeah, that's what we want. Well, what about his mysticism? Well, what is that? Well, you know, Daniel, the book of Daniel, chapter 7, the Son of Man will come floating in on that white cloud. Get off that white cloud, do his business that he has to have done, get back on the white cloud, go home victorious. Nobody will lay one finger on him. That was supposed to be a characteristic of the Messiah. Also, he was to do that. Did Jesus have a white cloud? Well, we never saw it. He never drove it here if he had one. Was he a mystic? Well, not really. He got criticized, matter of fact, for being more of a party person. He seemed unlike one of his sidekicks, John the Baptist, who was very ascetic, probably mystical. Jesus spent most of his time eating and drinking and hobnobbing with all of the kind of scuds of the earth that you're not supposed to be with. And so he's your Messiah, huh? A guy who hobnobs with the scud of the earth, has no mystical bent whatsoever. But you can see it's getting a little tough. They're really going after us. Finally, they're going to pull out their big ace in the hole. Jesus end up? What's the problem? Well, how did he end up? Well, he ended up dead. Oh, really? How'd that happen? Well, he got in trouble. And he upset the Jewish authorities, and he upset the Roman authorities. And they thought that he could cause a lot of trouble. And they got this charges trumped up against him that he had the potential to be a political insurrectionist, a guy who had no violent bones at all in his body, but nonetheless, that's what they accused him of. And the penalty for that is the worst form of death that we have, namely crucifixion. So that's what happened to him. He got crucified. He shouldn't have, but he did. He got crucified. So he died in a degrading way. Not in an honorable way, like stoning. That was the honorable way. They had to have execution. Stoning people was considered suitable, but not crucifixion. The only people you ever crucified were runaway slaves and political insurrectionists. And we even had a law in the Roman Empire, no Roman citizen could ever be crucified because it was too degrading. And that's how your Messiah ended up? Well, factually, yeah. Well, there were people who said that he didn't stay dead. I mean, there were people who said they had seen him, but we can't prove that. I mean, nobody was really there or anything like that. They said they found the tomb and it was empty, but a lot of things could have happened for an empty tomb. Well, then they point out to us, you're aware, aren't you, that a dead Messiah is an absolute contradiction in terms? There is no such thing as a dead Messiah. If you have a Messiah, he can't be somebody who got killed. So what are we going to do? Those are all serious accusations that have been leveled at us, trying to point out just how stupid our belief is, just how ridiculous, even according to our own Jewish tradition. How can we continue claiming that Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah and the Son of God when he ended up dead on a cross in a humiliating form of execution? Well, that's our task. That was the task of St. Mark. When St. Mark decided to take the traditions that had started to circulate and he finally collected them, he decided he had to put together a story that in some way answered the critics. How do we understand a suffering Messiah to be something we believe in? Well, they found some interesting things. There were some things that helped us out along the way. One of the things we did, and it was a good thing, we believe that our critics were probably correct in that they had found references to the coming Messiah in the Jewish scriptures and held those up to us as ideals that we did not keep and that Jesus did not fulfill. We have to admit, they did that. They were pretty effective. So what we did was, we said, okay, we're still maintaining our belief. We still believe Jesus of Nazareth is the Messiah and he is the Son of God. Now what we're going to do, we're going to go back and read those scriptures all over again. But this time, we're not going to attempt to be objective. We are going to read them through the lens of our understanding of Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus is the Son of God. So we are looking for anything that would help us express that. We're looking for anything that would give us a language to articulate our own belief in who Jesus is. Now remember, the problem is not our belief. We are not wavering on should we keep believing this or should we not. We have made up our minds. Come whatever, we believe it. But the problem is we don't have a language to express what we believe. Our opponents look like they beat us pretty clearly because, see, they have the language. And so they can take that language and express a counter belief. And when it comes our time to point to language or passages or whatnot, we got nothing that we can point to. So we are looking for something. So we started reading. And once we started doing that, and mind you, we're prejudiced here. We're looking for things to help us out. We noticed right away when we got to the Psalms, Psalm 2 was pretty good. We liked that. It talked about Son of Man and all that sort of thing. But then we kept reading, and then we hit pay dirt. We got to that terrific book of Isaiah. Remember, Isaiah really is 3 books in one. Chapter 1 to 39 is what is referred to as Isaiah of Jerusalem, an 8th century prophet. When you get to chapter 40 through 55 is from a different author who lived at a different time. And so we call him Deutero-Isaiah or Second Isaiah. Not very creative, but it works. First Isaiah, now we got Second Isaiah. Second Isaiah was composed about the time of the second exile, 586. And it was composed to give the Israelites some hope. Remember, the Israelites now had suffered 2 major exiles. 721, the northern kingdom was wiped out by the Assyrians. Some of those Jews who were left up there came down south to the land of Judah. Now, the people who lived in the south, in the land of Judah, thought that they were never going to be exiled. They would never be attacked. And God would protect them forever. And they believed that because the sacred city of Jerusalem was there in the south, in Judah. Certainly, that's God's sacred city. God would not allow that city to be harmed. In that city is the great Temple of Solomon. And in that Temple of Solomon is the Holy of Holies. And there in the place where the Holy of Holies resides, that's where God is. You're not going to do anything to that temple. God will not allow that temple to be harmed. Well, God never got that memo. 586, the Babylonians, feeling their oats, decided now is the time. And so they went in and they just devastated the whole city. They devastated the entire temple. They packed up the able-bodied people and they shipped them into exile into Babylon. It was absolutely traumatic. At that point, the Jewish community said, we have, in effect, lost everything. We were told we were the chosen people, and we believed that. And being the chosen people meant that God would give us a big nation, lots of people, that God would give us our own land, we'd have identity, and that as a nation we would be a blessing for all other nations. God told us that in the book of Genesis, chapter 12, those first 3 verses, the so-called promise to the patriarchs. And now we lost everything. We lost our nation. We lost our land. We have no ability to be a blessing on anybody. It was in response to that devastating sense of affairs that second Isaiah, Deutero-Isaiah, composed his prophecy, which was basically a prophecy of hope. Eventually, the Babylonians didn't survive very long. The Persians came in and took over. The Persians had a leader whose name was Cyrus. And oddly enough, it was this Persian leader, Cyrus, who allowed and encouraged the exiled Jews to return home to Israel. Now, there were some good political reasons why he did it. But for Isaiah, those didn't matter. There was lots of good spiritual things. Finally, we will be out of exile. Finally, we'll be able to come home to our own place. And so when Isaiah talks about this, he paints the picture as rosy as it can be. Comfort, oh comfort my people. You have paid double for your sins, and on and on. And he talks about how now, to help you go home, God will go before you. And in the wilderness, in the desert, God will make this super highway. He'll cleanse it of all the hills, valleys, rough places. It'll be this smooth sailing road, and then you'll just go home, and God will lead you. It'll be immense. It'll be wonderful. Factually, it never happened. And that bothers some people because they wonder, well, how can you call that prophecy if it didn't happen? Well, prophecy is not just about predicting the future. There's aspects of prophecy that tries to instill hope. And for Isaiah, second Isaiah, at that moment, it was more important to talk about hope than to talk about facts. Because as long as people have hope, they will have life. We all know that. There is nothing worse than feeling hopeless. And if we can have just a small amount of hope, then there's still a chance. Well, once we lose hope, we've lost it all. And that's why people who are clever and know how to do that, that's what they go after. They go after our hope. Strangle their hope, and then you have it. And that's true. And so if you want to survive, if you want to keep going, you want to keep it, you've got to find ways of keeping that hope alive. And that's what Isaiah, second Isaiah, is trying to do. Well, we start reading his book. And all of a sudden, we found these remarkable passages. I'll list a couple for you. Isaiah chapter 42. Verses 1 to 4. That was one passage. Then we went and we run into Isaiah chapter 49, verses 1 to 6. And then we got excited when we read that. I'll tell you later why. Then chapter 50, verses 4 to 9. Once again, we're really excited about this. And then the most significant one, chapter 52, starting with verse 13, going all the way through chapter 53, verse 12. Now, what would be interesting, or is interesting, at least to me, is if you cut those passages out of your Bible, just took your scissors, got rid of them, and then you started reading, you would never know they were there. You would not miss a thing. The text would flow wonderfully and smoothly without those passages. Well, okay, so what? Well, that gives us an indication that those were probably later additions. These were separate passages developed somewhere else and then later on included in this second book of Isaiah. So why are they important at all? They're important because they make one major image come alive for us. The suffering servant. That is something that we've always believed about Jesus. But nobody would allow us to say that. Remember how we got criticized for talking about a Messiah who suffered, a Messiah who wasn't royal, a Messiah who wasn't like King David, and how they drug us over the coals for maintaining what they call us as the idiotic belief. Now, all of a sudden, in our own tradition, these Jewish scriptures, here's a story about a person who suffers, and not only suffers, and here's an important point, suffers vicariously. That means one person can suffer for another. Now, the reason that's important is that was not a common belief among Jews. Jews did not hold a belief that one person can suffer for another. They did hold a belief that sin could be handed down generation after generation, so you could end up paying the price for the sins that your great-great-great-great-grandfather committed, which to us seems unfair. And when Jesus is confronted with that issue about, what do you think about that, in the Gospel of John chapter 9, he doesn't believe that. He pushes that away. He does not believe sin is inherited like that. But this passage, these passages all talk about, it seems like a person. This person called my servant. And my servant is the one who gives his life for others. We see the reason those passages became so important to us is now we got a language. When you would go by, if you go back and read chapter 52, verse 13, all the way through 53, and we will read that passage as the opening reading of our Good Friday service. And if you're reading it through the hearing and eyes of Christianity and Jesus, you would have to say, that seems like that person had him in mind. That's him. That's exactly what he did. Now, factually, the author probably did not have Jesus in mind. The author probably meant the suffering servant to be Israel, thinking that over all this time, over all these years, Israel has suffered enough. And so now the purpose is to help alleviate their suffering and so on, so that the suffering servant in the eyes of most Jews would refer to Israel itself. Well, that's okay. We don't mind that. But in our eyes, in our belief system, it might be Israel. That's what they're talking about. But what we hear, what we take away from these passages, this is an outline of Jesus. And it's an outline of how we can understand Jesus to be the Messiah and the Son of God. And it's how we understand that his primary activity was not military. That his primary activity was not being a soldier. His primary activity was not inflicting violence on other people. His primary activity was service. Service. And we would believe and say, and later on develop teachings about this, ultimate service. And by ultimate service, we mean someone who gives their life for another. That's as much as you can give. That's all you have, ultimately. And that's what he did. So our faith says, all of that is in the background of the person who started to put together this narrative of the passion of Jesus. He says, this is the center of the gospel. This is what makes Jesus the Messiah. This is what captures the meaning of Jesus being the Son of God. And so we're going to incorporate that into our story and make that the center. And so that's why this passion narrative, especially the one we're going to be talking about of Mark, that's why this is so important. This is our articulation of the very heart of Christian faith. The very heart of Christian faith, and you can find it outlined in St. Paul, 1 Corinthians 15, those first 3 verses, that Jesus lived, suffered, died, was buried, and finally was raised up. That's the Christian faith in a nutshell. And that's what's at the heart of the Passion narrative. Another text that was very, very significant was Psalm 22. Now we'll get to Psalm 22, remember, when Jesus is hanging on the cross. And the last words that he says there, my God, why have you forsaken me? And we'll talk about that later when we get to it. But that psalm becomes so important. That's a long psalm. It's technically called a lament. And the way a lament works structurally is you start out by talking about how bad things are. Lamenting. And then somewhere toward 2/3 into it, you start to have a switch of mentality, and you quit talking about how bad things are, and you begin to reflect on how good God is in spite of how bad things are. And a lament generally ends up with some kind of song of praise. But when you read that Psalm 22, it would be good when you go home, keep that in mind, just take out your Bible, your Psalms, and read slowly Psalm 22. And then in the back of your mind bone, keep there that this psalm will be used to describe who Jesus is. And then see how that psalm looks to you. That became a very important portion of what that is. So now, we have our language, we have our confidence, we have our belief. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the Son of God. Now, St. Mark, the very first one to do it, takes all this material and shapes it into the oldest narrative of the gospel that we have. So whenever you're reading the Passion narrative of Mark, you are reading the oldest and first attempt by anybody to put together in writing the suffering, death, ultimate resurrection of Jesus. And that's why this section, this passage, and Mark especially, is so important. Tomorrow we will begin looking at the narrative itself. Now we've looked at this in the past 11 years here and there and a little bit. I put together, unlike in the past, some real details. We're going to look at this rather closely. Now closely doesn't necessarily mean boringly, or so don't give up already. We want to be as prepared as we can. My goal is so that when we get to Palm Sunday, and then later on Friday, there's going to be another version of the Passion read. So that when we hear those things read, we will have a whole bunch of light bulbs in our headphones starting to go off. I remember that. I know what that's about. I know how that works, which will hopefully enrich the whole experience of what we're going to do during that most sacred week of our entire year. So tomorrow, I'm just going to begin with talking a little bit about what the word passion itself means, and then start to unfold, okay, here's how the story works. So hopefully you will come back tomorrow. Otherwise, I'll be talking to myself. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son,